Nathen Harvey, welcome to the DevOps Diaries podcast.
Oh, thanks so much, Jack. It's exciting to be here.
Oh, well, I can tell you I'm very excited to have you on the podcast today, Nathen. Nathen, for the listeners, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself and who you are?
Yeah, for sure. So hi, everyone. My name's Nathen Harvey, as Jack has already alluded to. I am a developer advocate at Google Cloud, and I lead up DORA. Now, maybe you've heard of DORA, maybe you haven't, but don't worry, we're going to cover a lot about DORA here in this episode. For myself, I've been with Google for nearly 6 years now. I've been in sort of the DevOps community for at least the last 15 years. And before that, I will happily admit that I was working on Salesforce and helping teams use Salesforce, although today I'm merely a user of Salesforce, so I'm very far removed from what is the life of a Salesforce administrator day to day.
Nathen, I'm very excited, and I think listeners should be too, because we got some really great things that we want to talk about today. But before we dive into DORA and all the things that we're going to talk about, why is this conversation important? Why does this conversation matter for us as Salesforce admins or Salesforce developers or engineering team leads, whoever we might be?
Yeah, look, I think it doesn't matter what organization you work for, what company you're in. Your company is a technology-driven company. And if your if your company is using Salesforce, that's an important part of the technology landscape within your organization. We use, in organizations today, we use technology to create great experiences for our users and to help drive our businesses forward. And frankly, Salesforce is all about that. How do we connect with our users and our customers? How do we maintain those relationships over time? And how do we do that efficiently within our organization? And so in the same way that we think about sales operations and sales efficiencies, it's important that we think about technology operations and technology efficiencies. How do we get the most out of not just the technology that we have within our organizations, but maybe more importantly, the technologists, the people that we have in our organizations? How do we keep them motivated about the work that they're doing, aligned on the things that matter to the business and to our customers, and really delivering awesome technology along the way?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, looking after people and people motivation is a topic very close to my heart and close to yours too. I imagine, that we care
Absolutely.
about DevOps and releases and best practices and making sure that we can release at a velocity in a happier way. So you mentioned that you heavily involved with the DORA metrics. What are the DORA metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jack. So first, I'll even take a step slightly further back and talk about DORA itself. So DORA is a research program that's been running for over a decade now. And this is a research program that really asks this fundamental question of how do teams get better at delivering and operating technology or software? And it's really technology or software of any kind. And one of the big questions that we have as a research team is, one, does it matter? Does delivering technology help your organizations? Does it help your customers? I'm happy to report that our research confirms, yes, indeed, teams that are good at delivering and operating software tend to have better organizational outcomes. When we talk about organizational outcomes, we're talking about things like, customer satisfaction, revenue, profit, market share, all of these things. Technology matters. We know this from our research, but let's be frank, we know this from our lived experience as well. So the research is great. It backs up what we already know. And then, so as we try to measure this with DORA, we run into this real kind of fundamental issue. How do you measure something like software delivery? It's not like you can walk into a factory and see all of the software bits like moving down the assembly line and just count them as they go. That doesn't really work. So we have to come up with some sort of proxies for understanding how do you measure software delivery. And let's be frank, in our industry, we've had lots of terrible measures over time. I don't know if you've ever...
Care to name a couple?
Yeah, I would. I don't know if you've ever been measured or had your performance evaluated, Jack, by the number of lines of code that you've written, right?
I haven't, but I have heard people who have.
It's definitely been a thing. Like, hey, you're a software developer. What does a software developer do? Well, a software developer writes code. How do we know if they're good at it? Well, let's just count the lines of code that they've written. As you can imagine, this puts a lot of really bad behaviors in place, both from the leadership perspective that are trying to evaluate performance that way, and also as an engineer, well, I can always write more lines of code. In fact, I can write a 2-line program that will do nothing but generate thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code. Now, aren't I super productive? Of course, that's not the right way to measure how effective we are, how productive we are. So instead, the area that this research program really focuses on is what we call software delivery. And the reason we focus on software delivery is what happens after the code has been written, or the configuration, or whatever. And there's a moment after it's written where, or a time where it has to get into the hands of your users. And the reality is that any technology, any software that we write, any configuration we write, it doesn't provide any value to anyone sitting on my laptop. It only provides value when it's out in the production environment where real users can interact with it. But we also find in organizations around the world, organizations of every shape and size, that this is a problem. It's a bottleneck within their technology landscape. Part of this bottleneck, honestly, goes way back. If we go back, 15 years ago or so, this was the reason that DevOps became a thing. We essentially turned to developers and said, hey, developers, your job is to build features as fast as you possibly can. Build, 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 build. And then we turned to operators and we said, hey, your job is to keep everything stable. Don't let anything ever fail. Don't let anything ever break. And when we did that, what we did was we set up these perverse incentives where they're fighting against each other. As an operator, I know the best way to keep my system stable, accept no changes. Never change it. Everything will be fine. And so the developers get really frustrated because operators are pushing back on changes. Operators get really frustrated because developers are throwing stuff at them that they don't really understand, and it seems to always break. This is the crux of sort of where DevOps was born. Instead of us fighting against each other, what if we came together and collaborated and worked on satisfying the user and helping drive our business forward and recognizing that we're on the same team? So back to the measurements now. How do you measure that software delivery? Well, in our research, what we've done is we've identified and revalidated for over a decade now 4 key measures of software delivery performance. We look at 2 areas. The first is throughput. And for throughput, we ask question, or we have these 2 metrics. The first one we call the change lead time. How long does it take for a change to get from the developer's workstation all the way through to production? The second is deployment frequency. How frequently are you updating your production environment? And that's really good. You want to improve your deployment frequency. You want to shorten that change lead time. That improves your velocity or your throughput of your system. But on the flip side of that, we can't just push a bunch of, broken stuff through to production and have everything always breaking. So we have 2 stability metrics to help us sort of counterbalance that speed. And the first stability metric is the one that we call the change fail rate. Actually, that's what the research calls it. What Nathen calls it is the O-expletive rate. Because it's what happens when you push something to production and someone shouts out an expletive. You've been there, Jack.
Right.
You know.
I think that tallies with a lot of people.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a change failure. Of course, we want to reduce those. But the truth is we're working in very complex systems that involve, like systems like computers and stuff, but also systems. We, the humans, we're part of the system. And this system in its complexity is not infallible. In fact, we have to expect things will break. So when you do have one of those expletive moments where you've pushed a change and you have to roll that change back immediately or push forward a hot fix or something like that, our 4th metric is your failed deployment recovery time. So how long does it take your team, or rather your system, to recover and get service back to your users in the way that you want? So we've got these 4 metrics: change lead time, deployment frequency, change fail rate, and your deployment failure recovery time. Taken together, these 4 metrics, we can use them for any type of technology, which is pretty awesome. So you could use it for the mobile application that you're shipping. You could use it for your retail banking site. You could use it for configuration changes to Salesforce. Heck, you can use it for your technical documentation. A tech writer wrote some documentation. How long before that documentation is available to our users? So you can see it's broadly applicable. The other thing that's really interesting about these four metrics, I talked about throughput and stability. Traditionally, we think of these two things as trade-offs of one another. Either you can be fast or you can be stable. But
Is
what
that the
we've
case?
seen, it is not the case. It is not the case. In fact, what we've seen in our research over the decade is that these two components tend to move together. In order to be stable, you have to be fast. In order to be fast, you have to be stable. How? Well, this is probably one of the bigger insights of the research, and maybe not an insight of the research so much as something that we've been able to confirm. The way that you get there, the way that you get both throughput and stability, is through smaller changes. If we're constantly shipping smaller changes and always moving those changes through our delivery pipeline, what does that mean? Well, first, a small change is easy to reason about. It's easy for me to make a small change and hand it to you and say, hey, Jack, can you validate this change? Can you just look at it, make sure it looks sensible before we push it out? I can build up my trust that this change is going to do what I expect it to do. And then because it's a small change, when it lands in production, if there is one of those expletive moments, a change failure, reasoning about it, rolling it back, fixing it quickly forward is much easier. In the days where, and I've certainly been there, where we deploy changes to production once or twice a year, I can virtually guarantee that those deployments are going to fail, and we're going to have to rework a bunch of that work. So the idea is, how do we get to smaller changes so that we can better reason about those changes and we can continually make updates to our system in a way that's safe?
Yeah, thank you first and foremost for the comprehensive overview of what DORA stands for and what DORA means and why we care about this so much. And it translates really nicely to Salesforce and Salesforce DevOps, any technology, as you mentioned. And I'm curious about a number of things. I've got so many questions I want to ask you about this. I guess, where do people get started first and foremost when they think about looking at these metrics? You published a really great article. I think it was late towards the end of last year, where these are the metrics, but these are the pitfalls that you need to avoid when looking at them. And you had 7. I won't ask you for all 7 right now, but there's one that I think is particularly poignant, which is Goodhart's law, and there's a couple of others as well. But I'll interviewee's choice about what the key pitfalls to avoid are. But how do you get started, and how do you not fall into those traps that you mentioned?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And the article that you mentioned, I published it on DORA.dev, which is the website you can go to for all things DORA.
Links in the description, everyone. Don't worry.
Yeah, links in the description. Go click that. But yeah, it's one of our guides there. It is about those 4 key metrics, DORA's software delivery metrics. And of course, there are a bunch of pitfalls. Look, the way to get started, I think, is important. The first thing to think about is that when we ask these questions, when we're trying to assess that software delivery performance, we're doing it at the level of an application or the level of a service. So for example, you might want to think about your own Salesforce implementation. That's one application or service. You wouldn't want to compare that. Let's say you're a bank and you have a mainframe running in the bank that handles all of the transactional data. You probably don't want to compare those 4 metrics for Salesforce versus the 4 metrics for that mainframe. These are
comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah, exactly. And they both live in separate contexts, right? There's a lot of things that matter to each of those. So I think the first thing to recognize is you have to measure these at a team level. And then the other thing that I'll just offer as a resource is, again, back on Dora.dev, if you go to the quick check, we have, well, as the name says, a quick check that will help you quickly assess what are your team's software delivery metrics. And the truth is, you can wire up a bunch of systems and pull all of this data out of systems, or you can go ask people on your team, how frequently are you deploying to production? And the truth is that you're likely, at the beginning, you're likely to get good enough answers just by talking to people and by taking the quick check, which is a survey that will ask you through those 4 questions, just to get an understanding, a sense for where you are. Now, you mentioned Goodhart's law, and look, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And for those of you that don't know, Goodhart's law is basically when a metric becomes the goal, it ceases to be a good metric, right? So your goal is not to get to 5 deploys a day, 100 deploys a day. That's not the goal. The goal is to improve. At DORA, we have a little tagline that is get better at getting better. This is all about a journey of continuous improvement. And actually, the way that you get better at your deployment frequency or any of these metrics, I'll pick on deployment frequency for a second. One way you could get better is to show up every day and just mash the deployment button. Deploy, 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 deploy. That's not actually changing anything. It's not actually helping you. So this is where, in my opinion, the research gets even more interesting. We look at the capabilities that drive those metrics. And I think all too often people stop at the metrics and forget that the way to improve is by changing the work that we do. And when I talk about capabilities, I'm really talking about capabilities kind of in broad swaths, kind of 3 different areas. Technical capabilities, things like, I don't know, are you putting your configuration changes into version control so that you have a history of those changes that's auditable, so that it's easy to roll back, etc. Process changes. What sort of change approval process do you have in place? Do all of your changes have to go off to some change approval board who doesn't really understand the system, but there's like some change approval theater that happens in the name of reducing risk? And then probably most importantly is the culture of your organization. And when it comes to culture, do you have a learning culture, a climate for learning within your organization? When something does go wrong, what happens? Oh, something went wrong. Who should we fire? That is a bad response to failure.
Blame game is not good.
Yeah, it's not good. So we need to learn from that. So the way to get started, to come back to your question, the way to get started is to have a conversation. Maybe start with a DORA quick check and understand, how are we doing today? This gives us a baseline. Now look at the capabilities. Again, on Dora.dev, we have a capabilities map that will list out a bunch of the different capabilities. Figure out which one of these is our bottleneck, which one is holding you back, and then go make a change there, and then come back and retest against your baseline. Did it improve? If so, great. Maybe we have a new bottleneck now or a new constraint. Let's go work there.
Yeah, well, that's a really, really good point onto the whole ethos of DevOps, especially the way that we talk about it here at Gearset. Is DevOps is all about continual iteration and therefore continual improvement. You know, if you start with that one bottleneck, you know, one might identify itself, just move on to the next challenge, to the next challenge, to the next challenge. And, you know, hopefully you see a positive impact on those DORA metrics if those are the ones that you're measuring. And but listeners, if you're not already, go like, I hope this is encouraging you to go and actually measure this stuff yourselves and have a look at your process. What would you say to those folks that are thinking about this and looking at ways, or are hesitant, I guess, to look at improving their ways in sacrifice of reliability? So looking at some of those bottlenecks, you know, the argument is, we've always done it this way. It works. We don't really like it, and it's bad, but it works. What would you say to those people to push them over the edge and take that plunge?
Yeah, I think I first I would relate with them. It's you know, we are in tech, and tech, you know, probably many of us got into tech because there's an opportunity to always play with new things and always be learning new things. And boy, you know what? I want to learn a lot of new things, but I don't want to change. Do I have to change? Because I just want to learn new things because that's comfortable. But change is hard. And change probably involves more than just me. And so for those folks that are really hesitant, I think first and foremost, you're not alone. Change is hard. Everyone around the world struggles with this. And I think it's important to remember as a team, like, there's only so much change we can take on at any one point in time. The thing that I would encourage you to do, though, is to take that experimental approach. Can you find one thing that does not bring you joy, that introduces a lot of friction? Can you do one thing to eliminate just a little bit of that friction and see how that goes? I'm not asking you to boil the ocean or to change everything overnight, but find one small thing to change and try that. Do something differently. Maybe there's another team in your organization that has a similar process, but they've tweaked it a little bit. They've made it better. Maybe you can go learn from them, or reach out around the world to this global community that we have. And, a podcast like this is a great place to start. Let's go get some inspiration and see that other people are able to do this differently and still have success. And then when it comes to that reliability question, look, I think just going back to that finding that we have, speed and stability are not trade-offs of one another. They are mutually reinforcing. And so it can be hard to believe that if you've never lived it. So find a way to go live it a little bit.
Yeah. One of the interesting things that you started to talk about as well was the culture of your team. And something that I want to talk about a little bit as well is that kind of gets thrown into this culture piece, or the measurements for how happy a team is and how productive his team is the SPACE framework,
Yes.
which is relatively new to me, I must admit. So first, I'd like to ask you your kind of your thoughts and guidance on the SPACE framework. And something that I also then want to talk about in relation to that is there's also another great article on DORA.dev, which dives into generative organizational culture.
Yes.
So that's something that I found really interesting when I was researching for this podcast as well. And I think those two things kind of go hand in hand when explaining each other.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start with SPACE because that's where you started, and then I'll come back to the generative organizational culture. So SPACE is a framework for helping a team or an organization identify good metrics. And it's a framework really used for any type of knowledge work, if you will. So the SPACE framework can help inform how do we as technologists and engineers, how do we measure our work? But it can also inform our sales counterparts. Like, how does a sales team measure its productivity and its work that they're doing? So SPACE is actually an acronym for these 5 different sort of characteristics or categories of metrics that you might have. S for satisfaction and well-being, P for performance, A for activity, C for communication and collaboration, and then E for efficiency and flow. And so with the SPACE framework, what you want to do is think about how do you have, like, when you think about satisfaction and well-being, what do you think about? It might be developer satisfaction. It might be retention of your teammates. When you think about performance, what does that look like? That might be something like code review velocity. How quickly are you able to review code changes and so forth? So you basically go through each of those categories, and the intent is, as you're setting good metrics for your team, to pick 2 to 3 of those 5 categories. You certainly don't need metrics across all 5, and figure out what makes sense for us and is going to give a signal for that satisfaction, performance, activity, communication, and efficiency. That's how you use SPACE. So it's a framework for identifying metrics. Now, the history of SPACE is that it's a paper, and this framework was written by Dr. Nicole Forsgren, along with some others. Nicole Forsgren was one of the lead authors and investigators for DORA for a long time. So SPACE is kind of the next, or one of the next steps in her research journey. Interestingly, although the history doesn't really support this, this is the reality. DORA, the DORA metrics that we talked about, are kind of an implementation of the SPACE framework, where you've got things like deployment frequency fits into the SPACE framework. Okay, so that's kind of SPACE in a quick nutshell. It's a way to think about how do you measure knowledge workers and knowledge working teams. When it comes to culture, and of course, when we talk about teams, you have to talk about culture. Culture is something that has always been fundamental to DORA's research. And for a long time, we've used and sort of stood on the shoulders, if you will, of another researcher. His name is Dr. Ron Westrum. He's a sociologist. And what Westrum did is he has done research into lots and lots of different types of organizations and organizations around the world, mostly in like the safety critical space. So think emergency rooms, think nuclear power plants. And his primary area of investigation is how does information flow within those organizations? And by looking at that, he's come up with this, what he calls a topology of organizational cultures. And this topology has three different types of organizational cultures that you might run into. The first is pathological or very power oriented. You'll know that it's a power oriented culture where when someone brings up a great new idea, everyone is like, no, be quiet. That's not what we do around here. The
That didn't
next
come
is
from the big boss.
no, exactly. The next The next type of culture in his topology is bureaucratic. And this one is really rule oriented. Hey, that might be a great idea, but it's not part of our process. So we're going to stick to the rule book. We're going to do the things that our process has outlined, regardless of anything else.
I can actually hear the listeners going, "Oh my God, that's me right now."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And then the third in his topology is what he calls generative, a generative culture or performance oriented. And here, this is the place where we have to achieve some outcome. Yes, we have rules and we have norms, but these might be preventing us from achieving the outcome. Can we bend these slightly to get to the goal that we're after? And this is really where things like learning from failure really come into play in that generative organization. Whereas if there's a failure in that pathological organization, we might go back to the thing we joked about. It's no joking matter. Hey, something broke. Who should we fire? Like, that's not really good. In the bureaucratic organization, when something breaks, you might just sweep it under the rug. Yes, that broke, but let's never talk about it again. That's how we'll fix it. That's not a good way to solve that problem. In that generative, we're really seeking to learn. What can we learn from this? This was a surprise. Look, we're working in a complex system. What does this tell us about our system?
Yeah, it's so interesting. This how few truly generative organizations that I have either heard about from my peers or have worked for. Fortunately, I would say that Gearset I'm very lucky to work for in the fact that we are very generative. The way that we deliver software at Gearset certainly fits that mold. And I think one of the biggest the biggest things that's mentioned in that article on generative culture, which again I'll put in the description so people can go and have a look at that, is especially when if we link it back to the DORA metrics themselves and we think about change failure rate, and that pointing the finger that you mentioned, or who should we fire, the generative cultures that go, there was a failure happened, let's learn from it. Let's I think in the article itself it says inquiry. Failure leads to an inquiry, and I think that's one of if I look at an organization and if I was to try and go in anywhere and transform how they do things, I think that would be the first place I'd look, is your change failure rate. Instead of pointing the finger and say, who shipped this code? Like, let's look at how that code got to where it was and what can we do to prevent that from happening the next time, and then learn from each of those situations. And it's poignant because you've mentioned learning throughout this podcast already. Is learning is such a core tenet of what we need to do in our spaces to continue on improving. And by design, your DORA metrics that you're measuring will improve too.
That's right. And you've kind of pointed out one of the flaws, not of Westrum's research, I would say, but of the English language. Failure leads to inquiry. You can interpret that inquiry a number of different ways. Like, oh, this is a punitive investigation. We're going to go figure out. If anybody watches the
news recently, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not that type of inquiry. This is why we've often used the phrasing, learning from failures. That's a little bit more clear what the intent is there. But look, Dora's research has also shown that this idea of culture, like, it is one of the number one predictors, not only of better software delivery performance, but also of organizational performance. And of course, the well-being of people on the team. This is something that we look into a lot. And when we talk about well-being, we look at things like, how much burnout are you experiencing? How much job satisfaction do you have? What's your stability look like within your organization and on your team?
Yeah, absolutely. To wrap this all up, Nathan, and one last kind of thread of thought that I'd like to explore a little bit more, is how do we know in our organizations And how can we start thinking about defining what good looks like when we start to measure these things? Any of those facets that we talked about via the space framework or the DORA metrics themselves. What does good look like, and how do we make sure that we don't fall into some of those common pitfalls that we talked about? Goodhart's law. It's not a goal, but what does good look like for us? And how is there any aspects of those that interplay with each other that need special consideration, would you say? And maybe to kind of demonstrate that, are there any particular, what does like an elite team look like in terms of the DORA research and the teams that you survey and look at year on year? What do they kind of look like from that lens?
Yeah, I think, look, it's a very fair question and a good question, and a question I'm not going to dodge the question, but I'm going to come at it with a slightly different angle. So you mentioned elite performance, and one of the things that we do as part of our research program is each year we publish a report. And this report shows, hey, here's what we've learned. Here's sort of the state of the industry as of right now, based on the data that we've collected. And when we do that, one of the things that we do is we kind of look at those software delivery performance metrics, and we kind of do what we call a cluster analysis. And this cluster analysis allows us to find teams that have similar shapes or similar outcomes, similar performance metrics, and they're different enough from others. And so we often call those low performers, medium performers, high performers, and elite performers. The biggest challenge with that, though, honestly, is that I see teams turning around and trying to take on that Goodhart's law and say, hey, everyone must be an elite performer by the end of the year. That's not the intent. Our intent really is to show that, look, there are low performers and there are elite performers around the world. And one of the other things that we can demonstrate through our data is that there are low performers and elite performers in every industry, right? So my answer to your question is, what does good look like? Good looks like something that's improved from yesterday. It's hard to say exactly what good is. It's because the context for every team is so specific to that team. And the thing that I would say good looks like is a team that is continually improving and continually learning and driving those improvements. That's the thing that matters. It doesn't really matter if you're a low performer, medium performer, high performer. I don't care about those definitions. We put them in the report to show you that this is possible. It's possible in organizations just like yours. It's possible on teams just like yours. So you can get there. But the only thing that really matters is, where are you today and what steps are you going to take to improve that over time? At the end of the day, what I want to celebrate, if I were to go into an organization and say, all right, there's 200 teams within this organization, which one will you celebrate? It won't be the elite performer. It will be the one that had the most learnings over the past year, that made the most improvement over the past year. To me, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, but the most improved player awards, in your little league or what have you, it's one of those.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Nathen, I'd like to. I don't want to ask you any more questions. I want to ask you: Is there anything that you want to talk about that you haven't talked about yet, or?
Yeah, I mean, there is the one big thing, of course, that I want to talk about. I've mentioned a couple of times that the way we gather our data is we go and we run a survey every year. That survey is open right now. And so I'd really love every one of the listeners to participate in the survey. You can get there at dora.dev/survey. We'll take you right to the survey. And I want you to participate so that you can help all of us collectively as an industry learn what it takes to make a great high-performing team, and learn more about some of the pitfalls that a low-performing team might have. But you know what? I have another reason for you to take the survey. And that is, I think that the survey provides an enormous opportunity for you and your team to reflect on, what are we doing today? I always say that careful consideration of the questions in the survey is going to ignite some thoughts in your head. And I encourage teams to go and individually, everyone on the team, take the survey and then come together in maybe your regular retrospective or some team meeting and ask a couple of questions. On that survey, which questions were hard for us to answer? Which ones did we think we were really excelling at? What opportunities did that survey show us where we have areas for improvement? And then probably most importantly, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do next? What things should we try as a team? As just a small experiment, let's just try one thing coming out of that survey. And so I think, yes, taking the survey, you're going to help us further the research and you're going to help the rest of the industry. But I think you can also take it in a very selfish way to help you and your team improve.
Wonderful. Nathen, thank you so much. Like I've learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope the listeners have too. Links to all the articles that we've referenced throughout the podcast are available in the description. If you haven't already been clicking away on that as you've been listening, then please go away and look at that. Please take the survey that Nathen has just implored you to. I think if Nathan's done a great job of pitching it there as a learning exercise for everybody as yourselves. You know, I asked you, Nathen, how do we improve, or where do we get started? Just go and take the survey. Just go and take the survey, and you'll start having an idea. And for the very Salesforce specific folks that we have listening to the podcast as well, if you want to see what some of the DORA metrics look like in practice in terms of the Salesforce ecosystem, they are what we used in the State of Salesforce DevOps 2024 survey and focused on. So if you want to see the Salesforce context and what an elite team, etc., looks like, we also followed the guideline of Nathen and his team. You can take a look at the State of Salesforce DevOps survey too. But Nathen, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that our paths get to cross in person sometime soon.
Thanks so much, Jack, for having me. And look, the final piece of advice I'll give you is that no one can. We're kind of all in this together. And so if you found this interesting, I would encourage everyone to join DORA.community, where we have a global community of practitioners, leaders, researchers, all trying to figure this stuff out. I don't have all the answers for you, but collectively as a community, we can get much, much closer to them.
Wonderful. Nathen, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jack.